afternoon. I'm Mariah Besharov. I'm professor of organizations and impact at Said Business School, and I'm also the academic director of the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship. And I'm really thrilled to see you all here for today's Insights for Action seminar. This seminar series explores how researchers and practitioners are using research insights for action. And today, we're going to talk about Derek Bardowell's book, Giving Back: How to Do Good Better, in the context of broader changes in philanthropy and impact investing. And I'm joined in this conversation by Derek, by Bridget Custon, and by Harry Catchpole. And so I'll just briefly introduce them, and then we'll get into the conversation, and we'll have some time for questions from all of you at the end. So Derek Bardowell, who's the author of Giving Back, is CEO of 10 Years Time, which is a philanthropy advice and education company that helps ambitious donors and foundations repair harm and rebalance power by resourcing racial and economic justice with care and with confidence. Derek also hosts a podcast, Just Cause, which explores the intersections of race, culture, and philanthropy. And he's a trustee of 30 Percy Foundation and Mission 44. So welcome, Derek. Bridget Custon is an economic anthropologist and senior research fellow at Oxford Said. She's the director here of the Global Research Initiative Ownership Project 2.0, Private Capital Owners and Impact. And I think we'll be hearing a lot about that this afternoon. And Harry Catchpole is co-founder and partner at Tribe Impact Capital. He works with and advises high net worth individuals, families, charities, and foundations. Harry started his career at HSBC Private Bank in London and is a former vice president of JP Morgan Private Bank. So welcome, Harry, as well. So I wanted to start, Derek, with you and ask you to tell us a little bit about the book. You've described it in the book as a call to radically alter our approach to giving to good causes, calling for a change rooted in justice, not charity. So tell us, why did you write the book? Why did you write it now? And what are some of the key lessons for the sector?
Thanks, Mariah. First and foremost, there was something inside of me. I'd worked running portfolios for different funding organizations for about a decade, and distributed lots of money across 30 plus different countries. So there was something inside of me that just had a thirst to put something out there about the amount of really good work that's often unseen and unheard that just doesn't get funding. And oftentimes in running those portfolios, I'm not the decision maker. I'm advocating for stuff to be funded, but often I'm not the decision maker. And you would have situations where, just to give you an example, probably over a decade ago, I seed funded 2 organizations in the space of a year. And one of those organizations, the idea wasn't particularly a fantastic idea. It was very much of a, I would guess, a sticky plaster type initiative. But because it had lots of political interest, it meant that very much within a year it scaled and became a national program. It's now £1 million plus, or 10 or 15 million pound plus program. There was another one that was really tackling the root causes of a particular issue around young people, children and young people, that didn't have that level of political will behind it, but in terms of systemic change was going to have a bigger and profounder impact, but it's still struggling to be able to scale. There was another incident 10 years ago where I was working with this particular project where they were seed funding a number of different organizations that during COVID and after post-George Floyd were actually having a huge impact. But again, I couldn't get this resource. So part of it was, let me just flood this book with really great stuff, right? Just to be really simple. Because so much of it is unseen, unheard, and for all of the frameworks and all of the theories of change and all of these unbelievable decision makers that sit behind it, sit behind philanthropy, often they get it wrong. And being able to say that. There was another part of me that was also saying that no one really talks about the roots of wealth. No one really speaks about where investments are made, and the fact that so much of philanthropy, which is often 1 or 2% of people's wealth, really is offsetting some incredibly extractive investment practices. So we don't really talk about, you might be doing good and that is a particular mask, but actually are you undoing all of that multiple times over with the way that you're investing or how that money was accumulated. So there's part of me that really wanted to change people's mindset away from that notion of giving people look at philanthropy as people with wealth, a financial transaction with people with wealth, giving it to those that don't have as much money, to a notion of giving back. Whose money is this? And we really, really need to root the wealth in the knowledge and solutions of those that are in the front line of that harm. So really moving away that decision-making, that design towards those that are on the front line, and really starting to move philanthropy to a place where it doesn't divorce its philanthropy from its investments, but also to a place where it's rooted in those solutions from the frontline communities.
Okay, thank you. I have a follow-up question, if I may. So you've touched on this when you emphasize a shift from giving to giving back. And you have, I think, a really wonderful and powerful and important set of principles and practices at the end of the book about, what we should take forward with this new approach, right? What are the principles we should be centering on if we think about giving back rather than giving?
Yeah, and so part of it is it's not a framework and it's not a lecture. The way that it was written was very much head, heart, and hands. So the head part was, the first part of the book is very much about the context of philanthropy. The second part, the heart piece, is really interviewing different people to really understand their motivations for giving and how they give, and not just talking about that through the lens of just money. It's much broader than that. And then the final section very much is on principles, and just really saying to people, and this is not just philanthropists, it's not just impact investors or other people, it's just for anyone. If you're thinking of giving, here are some of the key principles, things like reparative justice, things like, really taking heed of the value of lived experience, abundance, the way that need is presented so much in this country and other countries is poverty. And there is just unbelievable abundance that lies in communities. So it's just a set of principles that acts as a guide for people that want to contribute to a better world, to be able to guide them in how they might be able to do that better.
Okay, and I wouldn't say it is a set of principles, but it's so powerful, right? It's not just a set of principles, they're the foundation, I would say, for really thinking about how we might act and behave differently and shift our mindsets. So I want to bring Bridget and Harry into the conversation. And Bridget, I'll start with you. Tell us about how the ideas that Derek's talked about and the principles that are in the book, how they resonate with the work that you're doing in Ownership Project and in your other research.
Sure. And before we get started, just thanks to you, Mariah, and the School Center for convening this, and to Derek and to Harry for sharing their time and their expertise with us. The Ownership Project 2.0 rests on the foundation of the Ownership Project 1.0, which was a study of large family businesses with revenue above $1 billion with a B US dollars per year or more annually. And we wanted to know, broadly speaking, are they more responsible owners than the owners of non-family businesses? And I found myself interacting mostly with family principals, usually men between the ages of 50 and 85. And in the course of speaking with them, they would, to your point, speak across their whole portfolio. They would think about their operating businesses, but also the management of the family's own wealth through an entity called the Family Office, or they would talk about the Family Foundation. And so I came up with a research agenda around family offices that Mariah is now involved with closely, and we are now studying the broader spectrum of family-owned entities, everything from family holding companies to family foundations, still family businesses, but now also family offices. And the key to the anthropological approach, because I'm an anthropologist by training, is that you have to grant a community the validity of their beliefs without judging them at the outset, right? If you want to know what a group of people think and what informs their culture, their local behaviors, their habits, you really do have to enter into that space and really just listen. And when I put the voices of the interlocutors over the years that I've had the privilege of speaking with, who've trusted me enough to be quite vulnerable and share, family histories and traumas and challenges, I actually hear how deeply subversive and challenging, dangerous, provocative the ideas in the book are. As a human in the world, I'm like, this is great. Who could disagree with a title like that? But when I think about what it means to be the owner of a business that received market share directly because of advantages secured through colonialism, through slavery, or families whose businesses were in extractives, right? Oil, gas, families that destroy virgin forests, right? There are any number of massive industry-defining family businesses whose wealth has been built up in really problematic ways, problematic according to the standards of the present. And so, you know, when you're calling for a view toward change rooted in justice, that's a really different ask than just impact investing, right? That's going to be bespoke for each family and be as much a personal and sort of trauma-filled conversation as it is a business one or a social one. And but that's also the power of bringing this set of ideas into the room, is that I think what's been powerful for me in talking with you is realizing that some of the biggest innovation and change actually isn't among the highest echelon of wealth holders. It's among those who have less wealth, but perhaps aren't saddled with these same legacies, ownership structures, can be more nimble with it. So innovation can come from some unlikely places.
Great, thank you. And Harry, tell us a little bit about the work at Tribe, and again, how the ideas in Derek's book resonate with what you're doing there.
Thank you. So Tribe is a impact wealth management firm, the first dedicated impact wealth management firm in the UK. And so at Tribe, we build portfolios for people to meet their financial objectives, but to align with their values and to create the change they want to see in the world, i.e. the impact. And my background, as you briefly mentioned, was in 2 large banks before starting Tribe 7 years ago. And for me personally, I spent the best part of a decade in traditional finance in a role I kind of liked, but never loved. And when I now reflect back on that and my kind of past career, I think about why that is. And for me, a lot of that is about what I was doing and to be frank, selling in banks. We're selling products and selling investment products. And you are invariably selling something that your client is almost totally disengaged with. And in fact, it is to the benefit of the firm that the client disengages with it. And I think that is wrong. Our clients invariably were parking large allocations of money with a big institution and then saying, you look after that, and I'm going to get on with my life over here, my hobbies, my job, my work, my family. And in some ways, the financial service industry encouraged that, and in fact, amplified that by saying, well, that's good, because if you want to impact this with your values, with what you care about, that could be really bad. And by really bad, they tend to mean poor financial return or less than market return or reduced financial return. And again, I think all of that is interesting, and fundamentally, I think it's wrong. And at Tribe, we try and build portfolios that understand more than just the financial obligations and objectives of our clients. That's still incredibly important. That's still what we do. We're still an investment manager, but we go beyond that. And to Bridget's point, we look into quite deep conversations around families past, family dynamics, which is, and we'll talk about this maybe later, which is challenging and not easy, and that makes it hard for people to join in. I believe that we come out with a better solution for us as wealth managers, for our clients, and for people and planet. The bits in Derek's book, and it's I'm saying to Derek, I received it yesterday, and so I spent a lot of yesterday afternoon reading it. It's a great read. It's a very personal read, and I encourage people to read it. The bits that resonated with me were around one point which you make, which is around better giving is not the absolute answer. Again, that would resonate with us in impact investing. I don't think impact investing in itself is the answer to everything. I think it's part of a very nuanced and complex system. And the other bit you touched on already is actually, there was a number in there, which I think was £67 billion of charitable assets in the UK, £67 billion, of which 4% is distributed on average each year. So that, we would say at Tribe, is a travesty in itself and not a big enough number. But our business is designed for that 96%. how can we align that 96% better to the missions and values of the institutions, the charities, or the individuals that we work with? Or at the very least, make sure it's not working against the mission and the values of those charities and institutions.
Okay, and so you've all talked about in various ways the people and the institutions and the organizations with whom you work, who you're studying, your research, and yet they're all wealth holders at some level, but I think they're highly varied, and there's a lot of nuance in that term that we often use as kind of a blanket term. So I want to unpack it a little bit. Tell us, and I'll start with you, Derek, a little bit about who you work with, and what you're learning about how to engage with the different individuals and groups with whom you're working as you advance this agenda.
Yeah, and just to say, when I wrote the book, it's the top 300 foundations.
Yeah.
They're now worth 87 billion. So that has gone up, but the percentage that they give away still remains around 4 or less %. So when I talk about, lots of foundations will have a mission, but actually when 96% of their business is actually their investments, then actually that mission is more of a mask. But in terms of who I work with, so most of the wealth holders that I work with, I would say probably 35 to 45 years of age. In general, lots of self-made millionaires, and lots of people that I would say, if they come to us, it's because they want to do something quite different. They want to do something bold and ambitious, and want to be challenged. But I think, to both Bridget and Harry's point, it's deeply relational. So we have a methodology in terms of how we work, and part of that is reducing that proximity between wealth holders and where the solutions happen at grassroots level. That's what we do in terms of the methodology, and also just as facilitators, as coaches, as advisors, really experiencing the bumps along the way with the people that we work with. And that's largely because we're not the font of every inch of knowledge. It's not a question that we know absolutely everything. So we're experiencing those bumps along the way, which means that having those conversations are deeply personal, deeply relational, a constant thing. But it all goes back to the roots, which is around people's values, and really aligning those values to not just their giving, but also what we seem to have a lot of with our clients is the structures that exist around them. And there's, we're talking about the family office, there's often not the structures in terms of the family office that aligns with, some of my clients' values. And so having those conversations is not just about values, it's not just about giving, but it's also about safety. And it's also about what safety looks like for people in that context, not just in terms of the family office or family relationships that can be less like, that's my brother, that's my sister, but this is a business interaction. So negotiating that, but also negotiating the fact that if you're going to be doing something bold with your wealth, which might be around tax justice, it might be a funding movement building, it might be funding the very things that is undoing the ways in which you accumulated wealth. It also means that you're sacrificing potentially family relationships. And so the journey is a very deep one. It's a very relational one. But what we're finding is that there are lots more people that, as we've become bolder with our mission, that want to be on that journey. We took I don't know if it was a risk, but 2-3 years ago, we really came out and we just said, we're going to be more mission driven. We're going to be really more explicit about what it is that we're trying to do as advisors. We often call ourselves not philanthropy advisors, but solidarity advisors. And we often say, what we're trying to do is get wealth holders to act in solidarity with the communities that they, want to work with. And so it becomes really important to take an approach that is iterative, that is bespoke, but also what we haven't seen is a fall off in interest as a result of us being more explicit, which tells us that there is a thirst for people to move money very differently, but also to align their investments, their giving with their investments.
Bridget, how does this resonate with the people that you are working with in Ownership Project 2.0? Are there similar challenges, different challenges? I know it's a somewhat different population in some ways.
Yes, so it's we've been studying wealth on the upper end of the spectrum, which as a business school for us, the question was what demographic of family wealth holders have the greatest influence by virtue of the size of the wealth that they own. And so that was really the motivation for starting with family businesses at the $1 billion revenue mark. And for family offices, we're starting at the 750 million assets under management and above mark, although we will be looking at family offices with smaller assets under management because of the innovation that can happen there. And for the most part, I'm speaking with the wealth holders themselves. And anyone want to guess what, regardless of country, jurisdiction, sector, the unifying concern of these individuals is? Just shout out, I guess. Legacy. Legacy, good try. No, some yes, but not all. What unites them all? Risk. Not risk. Tax. No, they outsource that to their advisors. What do they worry about themselves? No. I'll give you a clue. It was also the name of a very popular TV show. Succession. Thank you. Succession. Exactly. They worry about succession because every principal is going to have children, nieces, nephews. That's what makes it a family business. And it has gotten to a certain level of success for a number of reasons that likely are historically contextual, dependent on certain personalities, but meaning these are situations that will not be replicated moving forward. Right? They're putting the fate of the entire entity in the hands of genes, genetics, luck, right? Circumstance, things beyond their control. And so the reason that this worry, anxiety, fear, preoccupation, concern around succession is important for this conversation is because it creates an opening. It creates a moment of real uncertainty where for all of their advantages, the demographic that I study is in the posture of saying, well, got any ideas? Or what would you suggest? Or do you know any other families who have had a situation similar as ours? There is a real thirst for knowledge and an openness to new ideas when it comes to succession and how to prepare the next generation. And I think that there's a lot of energy around next gens and what they're doing. And both Harry and Derek will have more to say about that because you both work with next gens. But I think from the current gen, the wealth holder point of view, this question of what might be the vehicle for promoting succession or for promoting family unity, and might that vehicle be one that is something based in a new vision of legacy, right? Might that come from impact investment capital? Might that come from a fresh approach to philanthropy? These are open questions and they're very dynamic questions. And they're questions that aren't just about intent or ethics. They're about a need for new organizational structures, new kinds of vehicles, new kinds of legal entities to take a fresh approach. And so there's an opening, I guess I would say, to all of the critiques that might exist. There's an invitation and an opening to be creative about what might a form of family glue look like moving forward.
Harry, what are you seeing with the constituency that you're working with?
You didn't look like you were fully sold on what I was saying.
No, I'm fully sold. It almost defines our business. In that we sit, it's kind of good to go last year because we sit kind of between these two groups at Tribe. There's some interesting things about our business in terms of demographics. Half our clients are female and half our clients are under the age of 45. Now, those don't seem like very interesting demographics to most consumer-facing businesses, but in wealth management, I can tell you they're very unusual demographics. The average age of client of the UK's largest 5 wealth managers is 74, and they're all old white men. And that's because that's who's held the wealth for so long in this country, around the world. And wealth management in the UK has become laser focused on talking to those who hold the wealth, and that happens to be that demographic. And yet that's changing, and it's kind of pretty well documented around this great transition of wealth that's going to happen over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years as wealth gets passed on to the next generation. And interestingly, just from my perspective at Tribe, we've never targeted a female wealth holder or a millennial wealth holder. We don't use the phrase next gen. We certainly don't market to them. We just do what we do. We invest in how we invest, and we talk how we talk. And that seems to have attracted a part of the market which otherwise doesn't feel very well spoken to by the incumbent market. So that's, I think, interesting in itself. It's not to say that obviously we've got lots of older and male clients as well, because I think what's interesting to Bridget's point is that in how we operate, we are able to move between the various stakeholders. If I take my waistcoat off and put my suit on, I might look and sound a bit like a private banker from my old world, and that is fine because that is reassuring to certain parts of our client base. And we can talk about risk and return and risk adjusted return and volatility in a way which is the language they've spoken for years and for generations. And at the same time, we can shift gears and talk in a language of sustainability and impact and values-based approaches to a generation that is looking for that. And that, I think, is helpful for that piece around succession and legacy, because for most of our clients, their biggest fear is not missing out on 2% return on an annualized basis. It's about what is the impact of succession and legacy on the next generation.
So, I mean, I love this sort of changing the clothes as the symbol of going between these different worlds. And, that sounds easy, right? You're just putting something on, taking it off. But behind that is a whole bunch of work, right? To sort of shift your mindset, shift your language, and navigating those different worlds is not easy, right? So I'm going to ask each of you about the challenges that you faced doing this work, maybe some hostilities even in doing this work, and what tools you have developed, what practices you have developed for navigating them. Derek.
Rum. Don't take me to the right on that. No, so I mean, there is a reality that there's no amount of waistcoats and suits that I can put on. My clients some people that I might be pitching to will not look at me and see something that they recognize. And from that moment, that means that the way that I'm having to operate and work is going to be twice as hard. It's going to be on a different kind of level. And I guess one of the things that we did, the reason why we changed our mission, we're more explicit about it, was because we spent a bit of time trying to play that game where we were trying to put that waistcoat on and do the code switching, and trying to then drag our clients back then into the spaces we wanted to go to was really, really difficult. So then we just kind of said, you know what, I don't actually own a waistcoat, so I won't use that as a, but the waistcoat came off, and it was just like, this is who we are. And what we do is we are challenging in the work that we do. But what we're not here to do is spend all of our time trying to tell you what you want to hear in order to retain your business. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to give you all that we've got, and we're going to be very open about it. And maybe, just maybe, you will find a space with us where you can say the things that you've not been able to say in other places. So we often say we absorb a lot of risk on your behalf. We have to also, in that context, be protective of ourselves in terms of absorbing all of that risk. But we also see the value in being able to provide that space to move people into a different place. But I would also say that, that's not always what people want to hear. I released the book, and there was, there's been a few forums where people have been hostile and said things. I've had one person at an event that kind of said, Derek, why are you always mixing politics and philanthropy? You need to go to Whitehall. I've had others that have heckled and said various things because it's not things that people want to hear. they want to remain in a world where if you're doing good, even if 96% of your business practices are extractive, you know, my 4% is doing good for the world, but doing 4% of good for whom? And often in that context, it's doing good for you personally as a wealth holder, not for the needs that's out there. So if I get accused by people, and someone has, 2 people have come up to me and said, oh, you're stopping people from giving in this country. I'm like, wow, I wish I had that power to be able to stop people from giving. But if you want to put that on me, well, you know what? If you're doing it in your way, which is the traditional approach in philanthropy advice, is we're going to create such levels of cotton wool and safety around wealth holders, and we're not going to challenge. You know what? That money's not coming into my community anyway. It's probably not coming into things that's going to change systems anyway. If that's the case and the money's not going there, then fair enough. I don't have the power to stop that, but I think not having that conversation and not being able to, I think importantly, engage in that conversation is really problematic. And when we were having the initial conversation about this session, I was saying what often happens is, because I'm probably a bit of an outsider, you know, you kind of get invited in, and you get invited in for 30 seconds and you say what you want to say, and then you're sort of moved out and either not invited back in, or it's just like you said, it's like, then you end up in conversations that end up being black and white and not conversations that are more nuanced about it. So I think for me, it's very much, you know, the case of, you know, this is a very nuanced conversation and it's very difficult. And we're entering territory where we are invalidating our truths. You know, these are things that we are questioning, that's forcing us to unlearn. But at the same time, and we've seen this with so much movement building in recent years, from Black Lives Matter to Me Too, we are moving and we have to move. So if we're not having these conversations, and if we're not challenging our own truths, and that's myself included while doing these journeys, then what is the world that we're trying to present? And to your point about succession, what are we passing on to that next gen in terms of how they live their values? And I think, you know, next gen, and again, we don't market to next gen specifically, if they're turning around and saying there isn't a vehicle that matches my values, then actually, why should they sit there and try to fit into things that's not appropriate for them? You know, resource stuff that is appropriate for their needs and that matches their values. So that thing around invalidating truths, we understand the challenges with it, but at this time, with the world being what it is, if we're not doing that, then what are we doing?
Very true. So I was very nervous when I started on the ownership project that as an anthropologist, my gaze on my research subjects would not be welcomed, that they would feel like butterflies being pinned to a bit of green felt and be studied in a way that was otherizing or dehumanizing. And I found shockingly that the opposite was true, that the sentiment was people were saying, we understand that the sphere that we live in is so unique, so strange, so complicated that absolutely we should be studied by an anthropologist. Welcome. And so there was a real yearning for that kind of approach, number one. And then number two, so not a hostility as such, but actually a presupposition I had that ended up not being the case. Fortunate to have the rest of the ownership project team here, Judith Facer and Valentine Harasti. Valentine has undertaken a literature review of the top 50 business and management peer-reviewed academic journals to see what they have to say about family offices. And Valentine found that there are a grand total of 2 articles among the top business and management journals. And what this means is that the vast majority of what we know about family offices is based on primary data that's been collected by banks and by service providers. So when people talk about family offices, they're all either talking anecdotally, or they're talking about what Credit Suisse has said, or what UBS has said, or what Goldman Sachs has said. And that really matters in terms of what we know about that demographic. So the ultimate, I think, the thing that I also learned I had to do really quickly is come up with the quid pro quo. If a principal is going to be giving me an hour of his time, right? What's in it for him? I needed to come up with an answer about that. And the answer was, well, I get to actually tell you something about this unique, unusual demographic that you are a part of, because there is not a lot of data about it. And that indeed has been the selling point, right? And we worked with a couple individuals who sort of serve in advisory capacities to make sure that sandwiched within the research questions that we had, there were also some questions that spoke to the self-interest of practitioners. So these might not have been our questions, but we knew that these were questions that the principals would be very motivated to hear what their peers had to say. So things like, what's your dividend policy? What's your shareholder arrangement? They're not necessarily for our purposes, but there was a need to be strategic to make sure that we could give them information about themselves. So again, not a hostility per se, but absolutely there was a strategy required, right? There was a strategy required that meant first acknowledging what's important to them and then working within that system and within those constraints.
Any reflections from you, Harry?
It doesn't surprise me what you've said there, Bridget, in that as I was listening to you, I was thinking how one of our fundamental values is that of collaboration, and yet a lot of the established financial services industry is not at all collaborative. In fact, it very much isolates clients. And so the idea that family offices can talk to each other freely is very difficult. It's called Tribe for a reason, our business. It's a group of people with a shared value set who want to come together, and we try very hard to bring them together. Just in terms of hostilities, again, I was reflecting on this on the way down, and it's kind of the obvious answer is the kind of incumbent financial services industry, and the good examples of that kind of different ends of the spectrum, because there are some very good actors in big financial businesses who are investing a lot of money in sustainable and impact processes. In fact, I heard the CEO of one of these big organizations speaking recently about how much money they've had invested and about how hard it was to do well, all true, how expensive data was and how many data providers they needed, all true, and how that was a great barrier to entry for others to get into the market, which is, for me, just such an own goal, or so uncollaborative, so unaligned with the mission and the purpose of sustainable finance that it's almost laughable. To the other end of the spectrum, where the three of us actually met at once at a conference where a CEO of a large financial institution in the UK, I think not a perfect quote, but said, some of our clients do believe in climate change, they just don't want it invested in their portfolios, or they want it influencing their portfolios. Which will be a shock when they think about some of the climate-related risks that are about to hit them. Yeah, there's that obvious world of hostility, and then also there's the world of impact and sustainability, and your impact is not our impact, is not the right impact, is a kind of common mantra as well.
So we're going to open it up to your questions in a minute, but I just want to close with one last question for the three of you, which is, as you look to the future, what is one key trend or one key opportunity that you see in philanthropy and in the impact capital sector? What should we be focusing on or looking out for?
I think for me, the conversation of reparations is going to continue. I think there are more of us in the field really talking about what that looks like. And some of it might be reparations, like foundations spending down. We've seen Lankelly Chase have announced that they're going to spend down their endowment, to others that will be taking more of a reparative approach, which doesn't mean that they're going to spend down, but really look at the most impacted communities being the ones that's in charge of that wealth. So that notion of redistributing wealth, repairing harm, using philanthropy, impact investing, other tools to be able to do that, I think that will absolutely gather more momentum. And I also think that we are going to see more vehicles, different types of vehicles, alternatives to advice funds, alternatives to your traditional family office. I think we will start to see more of these structures that start to evolve that align with the values of wealth holders as well.
My number one trend is going to be vehicles or practices that explicitly blend the philanthropic arm of the family enterprise with the investment activities of the family enterprise, namely blended financing, catalytic investments, and then actually just those two, where there is an underwriting of some sort that happens via the grants from the family foundation, which then allows for a risk-taking activity to be undertaken on the family office side. So if families can structurally and from an HR perspective and a personalities perspective and a relational perspective work across what have most likely been organizationally siloed entities, I think that's going to be a massive trend. That, and also family offices who have kind of cracked the code and figure out how to do something and do it well, will have increasingly more common multifamily office spinouts whereby other families asked to invest in these alongside someone who has an established practice and seems to be going well.
Harry.
For me, the big thing is, we've already touched on it, is this transition of wealth. This huge transition. It's already occurring and only going to amplify and multiply over the next decade. The transition from essentially the boomer generation down to the next generation. And I think the elements that Bridget's touched on there around family offices and how they collaborate with each other and learn the lessons of how to deal with that will be incredibly powerful.
Much to think about. So open to all of you. Questions for our conversation partners today? Yes.
Thank you for my question is about the last point, which is the trend of the future movement. And how likely are we going to see these families are investing in social entrepreneurship or social enterprises? Because we know, like now, we see the economy going towards more meaning that the interest rate will go higher, meaning that people will prefer taking low risk, and second point, also like that, I think also the social things people are going to push those families to pay their social dues. I mean, in terms of the negative effect on the environment and also society. So we also spoken about the succession. We think that this succession will kind of include any sort of engagement with social enterprises, because of sort of like they kind of have a direct contribution with the society, and as well as they have more, let's say, some sort of agility kind of beginning that. Are we going to see that, or it's just like?
I'm not seeing it yet in this country. I'm seeing a lot of talk, and maybe some of that's because some of that wealth hasn't been transferred yet. Some of it might be because the vehicles are not appropriate at this particular point. As I said, I think in terms of values of wealth holders, there is a definite shift. We're starting to see that. In terms of the mechanics and infrastructure to enable that to happen, to Bridget's point, how does investments and grant making or philanthropy align? What does the 21st century family office really look like? I don't think that stuff is in place yet. It's also going to take one or two families or wealth holders to really be the ones to be the shield towards the big change around that. We've seen some of that with around tax justice and around, you know, wealthy people but paying more taxes, etc. There's a movement. The thing that I would always offer is, you know, we're always saying to the people we work with is that some of this is around imagining a new world. And that might sound a bit abstract and ambiguous, but ultimately, the people look around at the problems in the world and feel there's nothing I can do about it. Actually, the people that we work with that are those change makers, for want of a better term, believe that the world can be transformed. You know, they believe there is a mountaintop. And for me, investing in those visions is really important, but investing in those patiently You know, that was one of the things that used to always get me working in philanthropy, working in grant making was, you know, you'd read all of these articles about how long social change takes from conception to mainstream. You know, there's this famous article in the Harvard Business Review around audacious philanthropy, and it looks at apartheid, seatbelts, and other things that philanthropy played a role. You know, and every single one of them is like 15, 20 years before you got the movement. Yet we're giving out grants for 1 to 3 years, you know, restricted, you know, but, you know, and I hear all of the arguments from funders will say, oh, but we don't have enough money, you know, but fundamentally the system's not created to change the system, you know. So I think if you go back and think that probably 20 years, 25 years ago, there wasn't really much of a conception around social investment and impact investing just 20 years ago. And now it's like growing. I think when we're talking about these conversations around reparations, around giving back, around all of the things where you would say, what are the ways in which you invest where you can have transformative change in our society? I don't think that momentum is going to stop. Do I think it's going to happen quickly? Probably not. But I do think the momentum is not going to stop.
If I may, just briefly, from a research perspective, asking what's the relationship of family offices to social business is a huge topic. And I will say that we're trying to get information about that, not by asking directly about the topic, because then you get certain answers that might not be as useful as data, but we ask questions in our survey and our interview about length of exit, when you exit, has XYZ happened. We try to understand what the actual investing behaviors look like so that we can start to come up with some benchmarks and standards when a family office says that their capital is long-term or patient or catalytic, because right now those are terms of art. They literally mean whatever you want or need them to mean. And if we can start to say, well, it only counts if, you know, a number of criteria are met, you know, to me, that's a meaningful way of looking at the topic of what are they doing around social business, because it doesn't matter if they're funding it, but then exit after a year, right, without any support. It matters if they're going to put in the time and the work and the, you know, then it's different.
Good questions. Yes.
Yeah, I am Juliana and I'm here. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts or anecdotes about how you think politics or political planning affects share like wealth holders' values and what they want to sort of invest in.
So I'm just going to repeat the question for people joining online. The question is about how politics and the political climate affect people's values and what they want to invest in.
Hugely. I remember years ago, and I'm showing my age, but I remember when they had, I forgot what it was called, I think it's a single identity bill, when that came out, and that really stopped a number of funders funding single identity groups. And essentially there was the panic around multiculturalism, and they were saying, you know, if you were a charity that's serving a particular group, then you shouldn't be doing that. You have to have a community cohesion lens in order to do that, which fundamentally ruptured a number of organizations doing really, really good work, changed the narrative in terms of what organizations, particularly working with minoritized communities, could do and what they were able to do. And it also enabled really large NGOs to come into that space and essentially take that away from really specialist organizations. But everyone followed that trend 100%, and essentially you know, that enabled huge losses for really good organizations. You know, we have seen some of the regulatory bodies in this space weaponized by a number of the lobbyists, which has had a profound impact on a number of activist charities who's been under investigation. And you know, it only takes one minor bad headline. And I know this from someone that's come from a background of delivering programs and having the scrutiny of the press, who will write lies in a big front page and then apologize with one small piece to really undermine the trust of those that might be investing in you. So it's huge. And the lobbying around the role of charity, the role of philanthropy is really negative in one sense. It scares wealth holders away from being able to invest or to be able to declare what they're investing in. But it has a massive impact on this world.
Yeah, maybe just to add briefly on that. My perspective, I think your values are your values. The political climate around them really doesn't change your values fundamentally, although values can be fluid, clearly. Does the political climate affect the investment world? Clearly, you look at the last quarter was one of the worst quarters ever for renewable energy stocks. A lot of that has been driven by political rowbacks on climate pledges. So there's a clear connection there. It's interesting to see how longer term does that affect institutional and individual appetite to invest more sustainably? Possibly.
I'll say that there's a divide fundamentally between families that see state expropriation as a possibility and act accordingly, and those that don't. And that's a big dividing line. And then there's also a big dividing line between families who are coming from a conflict or post-conflict zone and those who aren't. Those are big drivers of behaviors. In the transcripts from the first ownership project, there were striking similarities across decades from Jewish families who fled during World War II to different countries, and those families who had much more recently fled conflict zones in different Middle Eastern countries, right? Very similar views around duty to the family, around safety, around risk aversion, because of this fear of loss. And so there's some interesting similarities that don't necessarily cut across the typical regional expectations, but rather how secure is the business, the family, the wealth.
Other questions? Yes.
Can I ask what activities and personal qualities do you think a good investor should have?
Yes, so the question is, what abilities and personal qualities a good investor should have? A lot in there.
Great question. I think resilience is an incredibly important characteristic in a really high quality investor. The idea that, especially in the world that we operate in, a lot of this is long-term investing, not trading. It's not day trading. It's a very different thing. And resilience is an important aspect, an important driver of maintaining a vision and maintaining a philosophy. Obviously, alongside resilience, adaptability and flexibility are important, not to try and contradict myself in one sentence. But I'll leave it there.
I was going to say there's two things. One, a willingness to sacrifice and understanding what that means for that person personally. But also, there is something around, there's some people that I have worked with that have an ability to believe or hold other people's truth or hold multiple truths. And I often believe, even if it's tough for them, even if there's a process that they need to go to, that they fundamentally can be in a space and maybe not understand, but empathize with other people's truth. It's a really strong backbone of change in terms of wealth holders that we work with, that ability to come out, or those two things.
Jessica, I want to turn to you to see if there's some questions from people joining online.
Thank you. I might just raise two that are related. I'm paraphrasing, but in this field, what is the most effective way to shift power? And is that, for example, you mentioned spending down endowments, is that giving better at scanning your book? Or is that about reparations? If the latter, what infrastructure do you need?
Okay, so broadly, the question is about the best ways to shift power in this field.
Huge question, but two sort of major observations. I think one, when the narrative changes in society, that is the biggest driver of change. And that often happens through movement building. So when you see, so if you're resourcing movement building and people that are fundamentally changing the narrative around violence against women and girls, racial inequality, or whatever it is, that is the huge driver. The second part in terms of rebalancing power is around governments and those that get to decide. But this isn't about just putting people around the table that look black, that are black or have brown skin. We know this from the current government, that just because of the color of the skin of the people that are leaders in this country doesn't mean that they're going to serve minoritized communities particularly well. This is about their experience. And this is where you have to take an intersection lens and really look at those that are at the forefront or being on the front line of intersectional oppression, being in those positions of governance and power. And I think one of the issues that we've seen is that the narrative around reparations, around racial justice, post George Floyd has very much changed. The problem is that because a number of these organizations are not particularly in tune with what intersectional oppression is or what it means or what it looks like, that they're going to grab that first person of color to put in their governance who will have higher levels of damage than people that are white in those particular positions. So for me, it's around that narrative change that we've started to see and continuing to resource that, but it's also around governance and really getting it right into government.
I just want to reinforce that it resonates with so much work in research and organization theory about the power of narrative and storytelling and culture, and the need for structural shifts and changes in power and decision-making really driven by both of those, not just one or the other. I think we have time for one more question, and then we will have time for more conversation over drinks. Yes.
I actually wanted to unpack what you were talking about, representation. The examples you gave were related to Prime Minister leadership of the UK, as well as examples of in the United States. And Harry had mentioned that all of the wealth comes from old white men in the UK, and the UK has a history of extractive wealth creation from other societies, other countries, from call the name what you will, emerging markets, frontier markets, things like that. How do you think about that conversation about, it's really good to have that conversation within the UK or within the Western world, but what about the rest, where we talk about climate change and both of the effects are outside of these countries, but most of the money is invested for these countries.
I'll take that one first. One of the greatest strengths of the Ownership Project, in my opinion, is that we're a global project, and I find it profoundly unhelpful, even as I've used the kind of these totalitizing phrases of family business and family office, because the geographic distinctions are profound and the logics are profound. And the fact that at the higher echelons, wealth holders tend to have a multi-jurisdictional existence means that on one hand, we have to talk about wealth holders at this highest echelon globally, but then these differences regionally can completely change the nature of a topic or issue. And I think that it would be irresponsible for anyone to be talking about family offices today without talking about how Singapore in many ways is changing the game and setting a bar that others are wondering if they need to emulate in terms of tax incentives for philanthropy, not just given domestically, but overseas as well. This could have an enormous implication, for example, for money that has left the continent of Africa come to the UK. Can you imagine a world in which there was a UK tax incentive for philanthropy given outside of the UK? This is a global perspective raises these kinds of questions. The Ownership Project is co-convening with a group called the Africa Venture Philanthropy Alliance, with whom we have a partnership, a African family offices community, where there are profound differences in who has the wealth. Are they white Afrikaner? Are they white British in South Africa, or are they a post-apartheid Black South African wealth holder, right? These histories absolutely matter. And in many ways are the whole story, right? So the answer to your question is, this is essential. This is in many ways the point. And there is knowledge to be gained by looking at practices within single groups. And then there is knowledge to be gained by looking globally and thinking again of this kind of cross-jurisdictional existence of many families.
Okay, I'm gonna pause us because we need to move. We stop at 4:30, but with the conversation in this setting, but I wanna, before we thank Bridget and Harry and Derek, I want to just let you know that you are welcome to stay for a reception to celebrate Derek's book. And there are copies back there, and we encourage you to take one if you don't already have one. And we invite you back in 2 weeks for our next Insights for Action seminar, which is to launch a new report on climate tech opportunities. And we'll be talking about how to finance and scale these opportunities. So now, thank you, Derek. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for being here in conversation. Thank you, Harry. Thank you, Bridget. Really for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.